The night had been Charlotte's only chance at freedom. But as she stumbled through the woods, she could feel William's dark presence closing in, his obsessive need to control her like a shadow she couldn't escape. She had thought she could outrun him, but deep down, she knew one thing for certain. A man like William doesn't let go easily. And now, there was nowhere left to hide. William Graves had it all, or so it seemed. A successful businessman in his mid 50s, he had built an empire from the ground up. His name was synonymous with wealth and power, a figure known in high society circles as someone who always had the best of everything. His mansion, tucked away in a secluded part of town, was a monument to his success, filled with art from famous galleries and luxury items that only the richest could afford. He had the cars, the yachts, and the charm that could make anyone believe that he truly had it all. But beneath the surface, Graves lived a life of loneliness and desperation, masked by his wealth and the lifestyle he had cultivated. For years, Graves had kept a string of younger women by his side, part of a carefully orchestrated arrangement where he acted as the sugar daddy, showering them with money, gifts, and the promise of a glamorous life in exchange for their company. The women came and went, treated like little more than disposable accessories, each one taking what they could before moving on to another wealthy man. To them, Graves was an easy ticket to an extravagant life. But what they didn't know was that Graves treated them like prizes, controlling and manipulating them to feed his ego and maintain his sense of power. He convinced himself that he wasn't just another lonely man paying for companionship, but a man of influence, surrounded by women who wanted him. Yet, deep down, Graves knew the truth. He was nothing more than a lonely, aging man who believed that his money and status could keep him from facing his own insecurities. He was terrified of being forgotten, of losing his grasp on power, and the only way he knew how to combat those fears was by surrounding himself with young women who fed his ego and made him feel desirable. Charlotte Miller was the latest in a string of young women who had caught his eye. Beautiful, ambitious, and strikingly confident, Charlotte was the kind of woman Graves had always dreamed of having by his side. She was everything he could never be: youthful, free spirited, and independent. Charlotte had quickly learned how to play the game, accepting the lavish gifts and expensive dinners, all while keeping Graves at arm's length emotionally. She never allowed herself to get too attached, knowing full well that Graves was a means to an end, a stepping stone toward the lifestyle she craved. But as their relationship progressed, something unexpected began to happen. Graves, unable to control his emotions, began to feel more deeply for Charlotte than he had for any of his previous companions. He became possessive, trying to mold her into his idea of the perfect partner. He wanted her to need him, to rely on him, and to reflect the image of perfection he had created for their life together. But Charlotte had her own dreams and ambitions, and she soon realized that she had outgrown her role as Graves' object of affection. Despite the luxury surrounding her, she felt suffocated by the constraints of the relationship. She began pulling away, looking for a way out, and in the process, Graves began to sense that his carefully constructed world was starting to crumble. The illusion of control that had kept him safe for so long was slipping away, and he feared that Charlotte, like all the others before her, would leave him behind. He couldn't let that happen, not without a fight. As the weeks went by, Charlotte's disillusionment with William Graves grew. At first, the luxury and attention had been exciting, a whirlwind of designer clothes, private jets, and lavish dinners at exclusive restaurants. But soon, the shine wore off. Charlotte realized she had become another accessory in Graves' life, a trophy to flaunt at parties, and little more. His possessiveness began to suffocate her, his expectations of loyalty and devotion growing more intense. He was a man who had spent his life acquiring power and control, and now he was trying to do the same with her. The freedom she had once enjoyed seemed to vanish with every passing day. Charlotte, once so independent and full of promise, now found herself trapped in a gilded cage. Graves' need to dominate her life became more evident with each passing interaction. He grew suspicious of her whereabouts, questioning her about every phone call, every late-night outing, every interaction with anyone other than him. What had started as a relationship built on mutual benefit turned into a tense power struggle. Graves had started checking her social media accounts, demanding to know who she was talking to and where she was going. His calls and texts became incessant, each one more possessive than the last. His jealousy burned hot, and the constant surveillance began to feel less like love and more like control. Charlotte, who had once relished the attention, now felt like a prisoner. She began to distance herself emotionally, retreating into the walls of her own mind, searching for a way out. It wasn't just the surveillance or the jealousy that bothered her. It was the manipulation. Graves didn't just want her company. He wanted her to need him, to believe she couldn't live without him. She began to realize that, beneath the surface, he was terrified of being abandoned, just like any other man who used his wealth to try to fill the emptiness inside. But Charlotte was no longer willing to play the part of the grateful girlfriend. She had started meeting with other men, keeping her options open, knowing that this relationship had a shelf life. She had dreams that stretched beyond the confines of Graves' mansion, dreams of freedom and success on her own terms. One evening, she met a man, someone closer to her age, someone who didn't see her as a trophy or a prize to be won, but as an equal. They had started seeing each other, talking about the future, about what they could achieve together without the shadow of Graves hanging over them. It was the kind of connection Charlotte had craved all along, something authentic and exciting, and it filled her with a sense of hope for the first time in months. But Graves couldn't stand it. He had noticed the change in her, the way she seemed less eager to please him, the way she'd stopped wearing the smile he had come to expect. He became suspicious of her late night outings and the new man she'd been spending time with. His jealousy, already intense, began to boil over, and he started demanding answers. When Charlotte refused to explain herself, the tension between them reached a boiling point. His anger was a controlled fury, simmering beneath the surface, but she could feel it building. She had begun making plans to leave, to start a new life free from the chains of his manipulation. But Graves wasn't about to let her go that easily. He couldn't bear the thought of losing her, not after everything he had invested in their relationship, and not after the control he had fought so hard to maintain. His sense of entitlement, his belief that money and power could keep her by his side, blinded him to the reality that she was slipping away. The pressure on Charlotte grew unbearable, and she knew the time had come to make her move. She couldn't stay another day in a relationship that had drained her spirit. But as she planned her escape, little did she know that Graves, desperate and angry, was preparing to take matters into his own hands in a way she could never have imagined. It was on a quiet evening in mid-July that everything came to a head. The night had started like any other, with Charlotte going through her usual routine. Dinner at the mansion, a few glasses of wine, and the empty, strained conversation that had become all too familiar between her and William. But that night, something was different. The tension in the air was palpable, thicker than it had been in weeks. Charlotte had made up her mind. She couldn't do it anymore. The life she had been living with William, the lies, the manipulation, and the constant monitoring had worn her down. She had been planning for weeks, secretly making arrangements to leave, to finally break free from the gilded cage he had created for her. She had even begun packing some of her things, stashing them in a bag, preparing for the moment when she would walk out the door for good. It wasn't just the thought of freedom that made her heart race. It was the overwhelming desire to escape the suffocating grip of a man who had grown dangerously obsessed with her. That night, Charlotte decided to confront him. She had waited for the right moment, and it had finally arrived. She couldn't run away in the dark of night, leaving him to figure it out on his own. She needed to face him, to make it clear that this was over. She had rehearsed what she was going to say, but when the time came, the words escaped her. Instead, she sat across from him, nervously twisting the stem of her wine glass as he casually looked over his phone, unaware of the storm brewing in her mind. "William," she started, her voice trembling slightly. "We need to talk." He lowered the phone, his gaze shifting to her. His expression was unreadable, but there was an underlying tension in his eyes, as if he already sensed something was wrong. "What about?" he asked, his tone colder than usual. Charlotte took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. I can't do this anymore, she said, her voice gaining strength. This, this relationship, the way you control everything, the constant surveillance, it's too much. I need my life back. I need to be free. The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. William's face twisted, his calm exterior cracking for the first time. He didn't want to hear it. He couldn't accept it. He had spent so long building a life where he controlled every aspect of it, from the businesses he ran to the women who surrounded him. Charlotte had been his possession, just another element of his carefully crafted world, and now she was slipping away. You think you can just walk away from me? He finally spoke, his voice low, almost threatening. His eyes darkened, and Charlotte could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The man who had been so charming, so seemingly kind and generous, was now a stranger, someone she no longer recognized. His tone was sharp, his words cutting through the air like a blade. I've already made up my mind, William, she said, trying to stand firm despite the growing fear in her chest. I'm leaving. I'm done. At that moment, everything changed. William's face contorted with rage. His eyes widened, a mix of disbelief and anger flooding his features. The room, once warm and cozy, felt suffocating now, as if the walls were closing in on her. His anger boiled over. The control that had once seemed so subtle and calculated turned into something much darker. His hand shot out, grabbing Charlotte's wrist with a force she hadn't expected, pulling her toward him. You're mine, he yelled, his voice growing louder, more frantic. I made you who you are. I gave you everything. And you're just going to walk away like this? No one else will ever love you the way I do. Charlotte tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. The fear that had been building inside her morphed into something more intense, terror. She could see the wildness in his eyes, the desperation. She had pushed him too far, and now he was no longer the man she had once known. This was someone else entirely, someone capable of anything. She had underestimated how far William would go to keep his hold on her. In a panic, she struggled to break free from his grip, but he was too strong. His anger, his sense of entitlement, surged through him, clouding his judgment. He was losing control, and Charlotte could feel it. It was in the way his hands shook, in the way his breath came out in uneven bursts. She realized, too late, that this wasn't going to end with her walking out the door. Her decision had sealed her fate, and there was no turning back now. The moment she had dreaded, the moment she had tried to avoid, was finally here. William was not going to let her go without a fight. The hours that followed were a blur of confusion and terror for Charlotte. William's grip on her wrist remained tight, unyielding, as he dragged her through the house, his eyes wild with fury. She tried to break free, but his strength was overwhelming, and the fear she felt was almost suffocating. The man who had once charmed her with his smooth words and lavish gifts was now a stranger, consumed by rage and obsession. His anger twisted everything he had once stood for. No longer the calm, calculated businessman, he was now the embodiment of possessiveness and control. Charlotte's mind raced as she tried to make sense of what was happening. Her thoughts were scattered, but one thing was clear. She had to escape before it was too late. Every attempt to reason with him was met with more aggression. She pleaded with him, begged him to let her go, but he only grew angrier. The more she resisted, the more he seemed to lose his grip on reality, as if her leaving him was the final blow to the perfect world he had built. They ended up in the living room, and the tension was unbearable. Charlotte could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the sound of it deafening in her ears. She could see the sweat beading on William's forehead, his breathing heavy and ragged, and for the first time, she realized just how unhinged he had become. The man who had so carefully curated every aspect of his life was now a wild animal, backed into a corner, desperate and dangerous. You're not going anywhere, he said through gritted teeth, his voice a low, guttural growl. You're mine, Charlotte. I gave you everything. You owe me. Charlotte's blood ran cold. She could feel the weight of his words pressing down on her, suffocating her. The more he spoke, the more she realized how far he had fallen from the man she had once known. She had been nothing more than a possession to him, a prize to be claimed, and now, in his mind, she was a commodity he couldn't bear to lose. I don't owe you anything, William, she replied, her voice trembling, but she refused to back down. I never asked for this. I never wanted any of it. His eyes flashed with rage. In that instant, Charlotte knew she had pushed him too far. His mind was no longer in control. His obsession had taken over completely. Before she could react, he shoved her backward, sending her crashing into the nearby sofa. The force of the impact knocked the breath from her body, but she didn't have time to recover. William was already looming over her, his hands shaking as they reached for her again. "You're going to regret this," he hissed, his words dripping with venom. Charlotte scrambled to her feet, her mind racing for a way out, but there was nowhere to go. The door was too far away, and she was trapped in this house with a man who had completely lost his mind. In her panic, she spotted the vase on the coffee table. It was heavy, a fine porcelain piece, and it was the only thing within reach. Without thinking, she grabbed it and swung it toward him, the sharp edge hitting his shoulder. The force of the blow caused him to stumble back, momentarily disoriented. It was her only chance. Charlotte bolted for the door, her heart racing as she pushed past him and sprinted toward the front entrance. She reached for the door handle, but as her hand closed around it, she heard his footsteps behind her. He was coming, and he was angry, furious beyond reason. She yanked the door open and ran into the night, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The house that had once seemed like a sanctuary now felt like a prison, and Charlotte was willing to risk everything to escape. But even as she ran through the yard, William's voice echoed behind her, a promise that sent chills down her spine. "You can't run from me, Charlotte. You'll never get away." The darkness swallowed her as she pushed forward, her mind set on nothing but survival. She couldn't let him catch her. She couldn't go back to that house, to that life. And yet she knew, deep down, that her escape was only the beginning of something much darker. William Graves wasn't a man who would let go easily. She had only triggered the storm, and now it was coming for her. Charlotte ran as fast as her legs could carry her, her heart hammering in her chest, each beat a frantic reminder of the danger she was in. The cool night air burned in her lungs, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't slow down. She heard William's angry shouts behind her, but she didn't dare look back. Her mind was focused solely on getting as far away from the mansion as possible, away from the man who had once been her escape but had now become her worst nightmare. The gravel beneath her feet crunched with each step, and the distant lights of the mansion began to fade, swallowed by the darkness of the surrounding woods. She didn't know where she was going. All she knew was that she had to put as much distance between herself and William as she could. Her thoughts raced as she stumbled through the trees, the fear pushing her forward. She had made it out of the house, but she knew it wasn't over. William wouldn't just let her go. He was a man who was used to getting what he wanted, no matter the cost. His obsession with control had driven him to this point, and Charlotte could feel it deep in her gut. He wouldn't stop until he had her back. She stumbled over the uneven ground, her foot catching on a root, but she pushed through the pain, determined not to fall. The adrenaline coursing through her body made everything feel surreal, as if the world around her had become a blur of shadows and sound. The muffled sounds of the night, crickets, distant animals, the rustle of leaves, were drowned out by the thudding of her own heartbeat. She didn't know how much time had passed or how far she had run, but eventually her body began to slow. The sharp, burning ache in her legs made it impossible to keep up the same pace. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and the world around her seemed to spin as exhaustion took hold. She knew she couldn't keep running forever, but there was no time to rest. She had to find somewhere to hide. Just as she was beginning to feel the weight of the situation, a flicker of light caught her attention in the distance. It was faint, barely visible through the trees, but it was enough to give her a sense of hope. She stumbled toward it, praying that it wasn't just a trick of her mind. As she drew closer, the light grew brighter, revealing a small cabin tucked away in the woods. It wasn't much, just a modest structure, but it offered a glimmer of safety in the darkness. Without hesitation, Charlotte approached the door, her hands trembling as she reached for the handle. She was exhausted, her body battered from the physical toll of the night. But she couldn't let up now. She had to get inside, to find some shelter before William caught up with her. The door creaked open with a force that echoed through the quiet night, and Charlotte slipped inside, closing it as quietly as she could behind her. The inside of the cabin was dimly lit, with only a few candles flickering on a small table in the corner. It smelled faintly of wood and earth, but there was no time to take it all in. She needed to think, to come up with a plan. She had to figure out what to do next. Charlotte leaned against the door, her chest heaving as she tried to steady her breathing. Her mind raced through options. What could she do to stay safe? What if William was already on his way, already looking for her? She knew she couldn't stay in the cabin long. It wouldn't take long for him to find it, and when he did, he would tear the place apart searching for her. She looked around the small room, her eyes scanning for anything she could use to defend herself. A heavy iron skillet sat on the stove, a potential weapon, and a small stack of firewood in the corner. The cabin was sparse, but it would have to do. Her mind spun with ideas, each one darker than the last. There was no escaping the fact that she was running out of options. The realization hit her hard. There was no easy way out of this. William had made it clear that he would stop at nothing to keep her under his control, and now she was trapped in a small cabin with nowhere to run. The fear that had gripped her moments ago began to give way to a cold, steady determination. She had come too far to let him win. She couldn't let him control her life any longer. As the minutes dragged on, the silence of the cabin felt deafening. Charlotte's mind raced, but one thing was clear. She had to keep moving, keep fighting, because if she didn't, William would find a way to finish what he had started. She couldn't let that happen. She wouldn't. The sound of approaching footsteps snapped her out of her thoughts. It was him. William had found her.